The
Sold
auction
for
ended with a single sound.
$100
One
to
lonely
Mr.
bid.
Ethan Ward.
$100, and the haunted cabin on Winter Hill belonged to a man who should have walked away. Ethan Ward thought he was buying peace, a quiet place where a weary soldier and his dog could start over. But some houses don't keep secrets. They guard them. And when Ranger began to dig beneath the old fireplace, the
What is
snow
it,
itself
boy?
seemed to whisper, "Not everything buried stays forgotten." That night, truth woke beneath the frost, and a man who'd once survived war would face a battle far colder. This isn't a story about a cheap house. It's about loyalty, justice, and the courage to protect what's right when silence would be safer. Subscribe now to join us in uncovering the stories that the world tried to forget. The air inside the county courthouse felt as heavy as the sky outside. A gray Wyoming afternoon where snow hung in the air, waiting for permission to fall. Ethan Ward sat in the back row, his posture straight, his hands folded neatly over his knees. Years of discipline had carved him into a man who occupied space quietly, without apology. At 52, with a face weathered by both war and wind, Ethan had learned that silence was sometimes louder than words. The auctioneer's voice droned at the front of the room, calling out properties and numbers like a man reading obituaries, each one a story of failure, foreclosure, and forgetting. The locals filled the benches with slumped shoulders and tired eyes. No one looked up when the next lot appeared on the screen. Parcel 47, the house on Winter Hollow Hill. That name alone was enough to still the shuffling of papers, to draw a ripple of whispers through the room. Everyone knew Winter Hollow. Everyone knew the stories. Some said a man had disappeared there 15 years ago, his truck still parked in the drive. Others whispered that strange lights flickered in the windows when the moon was high, that animals avoided the property like it carried a scent not of earth, but of memory. Ethan listened without expression as the auctioneer cleared his throat, his voice faltering for the first time that afternoon. "Starting bid, $100, he announced, trying to sound official but unable to mask the discomfort in his tone. Silence spread like frost. Heads turned, eyes darting around the room to see if anyone would be foolish enough to lift a hand. No one did. Then, from the back of the room, a low scrape of wood on wood echoed as Ethan raised his bidding paddle. "100, he said, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the hush like a steady wind. The auctioneer blinked, surprised. Do I hear 150? He asked, scanning the crowd. Nothing. Not a breath, not a murmur. The silence was so complete that even the ancient wall clock seemed to hesitate between ticks. The auctioneer sighed, his tone almost apologetic. "Sold," he said finally, the gavel striking the block with a hollow crack. "To the gentleman in the back for $100. Ethan felt the moment land like the closing of a door behind him. At his feet, Ranger, his gray and tan German shepherd, lifted his head. The old K9's amber eyes met his master's, and he gave a quiet, approving woof, as if to say, "Another mission begins." Ethan reached down, brushed his hand over the dog's thick fur, and stood. The benches creaked as he passed, the locals watching him with a mixture of pity and unease. To them, he was an outsider, a stranger walking willingly into a graveyard of bad luck. But to Ethan Ward, who had seen worse things than ghosts, the idea of a cursed house almost felt like peace. Outside, the snow had begun to fall in slow, deliberate flakes, melting on his jacket's tam-tam, worn shoulders. The courthouse door shut behind him with a heavy thud, and for a moment he stood there, breathing in the cold. The air smelled of pine, iron, and distance. Ranger pressed close against his leg, the leash slack between them, his every movement echoing years of quiet partnership. They had been together through 3 tours overseas, through explosions that lit up foreign skies, through nights when silence was the only friend left alive. Now, in the middle of nowhere, they were beginning something new, something neither of them understood yet. The truck was old, a beaten-up 2003 Chevy with more scars than paint. Ethan climbed in, Ranger jumping gracefully into the passenger seat. On the dashboard sat a folded map and a thermos of coffee gone cold. As the engine coughed to life, the radio flickered between static and ghost voices from distant towns. He didn't need directions. He had memorized the road. Winter Hollow lay 16 miles north beyond the edge of comfort, where the forest began to climb the mountains and the wind spoke in its own language. The drive was slow, the tires crunching over frozen gravel. The world outside blurred into shades of white and gray, fences leaning like tired sentinels guarding empty fields. The further he drove, the more the snow deepened, until the road narrowed to a single lane flanked by dark trees heavy with ice. Somewhere between the miles, the hum of the truck became a heartbeat, steady and solitary. Ranger sat still, ears twitching occasionally, eyes scanning the landscape as if reading stories only a dog could see. By the time the sun dipped low, the house appeared, a silhouette at the top of a rise, half hidden by trees. The roof sagged, the porch leaned forward as if whispering secrets to the snow. The windows were dark, but even from the road Ethan could feel that peculiar stillness, the kind that doesn't belong to the living. He parked at the bottom of the hill, turned off the ignition, and listened. Nothing. No wind, no bird, not even the crack of settling ice. Just the sound of his own breathing and the faint creak of the cooling engine. He and Ranger climbed the hill slowly. The path was overgrown, lined with weeds now frozen stiff, crunching beneath his boots. When they reached the porch, the steps groaned beneath his weight. The front door hung slightly open, the lock broken long ago. He pushed it with his gloved hand, and it swung inward with a long, tired sigh. Inside, dust motes drifted through the cold air, turning golden in the light of his flashlight. The place smelled of cedar, mold, and something faintly metallic, like the echo of old storms. The living room was simple, a brick fireplace, a worn armchair, a table overturned and coated with grime. Faded wallpaper peeled in long strips from the walls. Yet there was something about the space that felt waiting, not abandoned, just patient. Ranger walked ahead, nose low to the floor, tail raised, every muscle alert. He stopped near the fireplace, sniffed, then looked back at Ethan with a quiet huff. The soldier nodded. "We'll get to that later," he murmured. "First things first." He moved through the house, room by room, noting the sagging floorboards, the cracked glass, the faint claw marks on one of the doors. Probably raccoons, he told himself, though the symmetry of them bothered him. Upstairs, he found a bedroom with an old iron bed frame and a dresser half collapsed against the wall. On the nightstand lay a book swollen with damp, its title unreadable. He turned it over carefully, brushing away a layer of dust, and caught sight of a name faintly etched on the inside cover. Marcus Heller. The name meant nothing then, but it would soon. As night fell, Ethan built a small fire in the hearth, feeding it with wood from the collapsed porch. The flames danced uncertainly at first, then grew stronger, painting the room in gold and shadow. Ranger curled beside him, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert to every creak of the house. Outside, the wind began to rise, threading through the trees, making them sway like old men whispering. Ethan stared into the fire and thought about how strange it was that peace, for him, always carried the scent of danger. He had come here for quiet, for a place where no one would ask about the past or the medals he never wore. But as the fire crackled and the wind moaned through the chimney, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching, waiting for him to find what it had been guarding all these years. He reached down, resting his hand on Ranger's neck. "Looks like it's just us now, partner," he said softly. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. Outside, snow began to fall harder, coating the roof, softening the world. The curse of Winter Hollow had found a new keeper, and for the first time in years, Ethan Ward felt something stir inside him. It wasn't fear, it was purpose. The morning broke with a fragile kind of light, the kind that didn't warm, only revealed. Snow still clung to the branches of the pines surrounding Winter Hollow, bending them like weary soldiers under invisible weight. Ethan Ward stepped out of the cabin and inhaled deeply, the air sharp enough to sting his lungs. Beside him, Ranger padded silently through the powder, his breath a puff of white in the cold. The fire inside had burned low, leaving behind only a faint amber glow, but Ethan didn't mind. He had woken with a mind already busy, drawn not by fear, but by the quiet hum of curiosity that had been planted in him the moment he found the name scrawled in the ledger. Dr. Marcus Heller. He didn't know why that name refused to leave his thoughts, only that something about it clung to him like smoke. He spent most of the morning walking the perimeter of the property, studying the land with the practiced eye of a soldier. The terrain sloped downward on 3 sides, making the house seem like the heart of a bowl carved into the earth. From the western ridge, he could see the faint line of a frozen creek glinting like glass. To the east, the woods thickened, dense, untamed, and whispering with a sound that wasn't quite wind. Ranger moved ahead, sniffing, marking, his tail held at half-mast, alert but calm. Everything about the land felt forgotten, but not empty. There were traces of life here, faint but stubborn. A rusted shovel half buried in snow, the remains of an old swing hanging from a pine limb, and a sign half eaten by moss that once read, "Private property, no trespassing." The kind of warning meant for people who knew too much. Inside the cabin, Ethan brushed off the frost from an old desk in what must have once been a study. Dust covered everything like a shroud, but under the grime he found stacks of papers, receipts, and yellowed folders stamped with the faded logo of Savorous Foods, a company he recognized from countless grocery store shelves. He flipped through them idly at first, finding nothing but routine invoices and memos until his fingers landed on a small spiral-bound notebook, its edges water-stained, its cover torn. The first page carried the neat, steady handwriting of a man used to precision. Marcus Heller, Research Division, Nutritional Innovation Project. Ethan frowned, flipping through the entries, lists of ingredients, molecular formulas, references to something called Project Kidjoy. He didn't understand the science, but one note caught his eye, underlined twice. Sample batch 7, neurological response in juveniles, unacceptable, needs containment. Ethan felt a chill crawl down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He leaned back in the chair, the wood groaning under his weight, and stared out the grimy window. Outside, the world was still. White. Perfect. Inside, ghosts of unfinished work whispered from every corner. Later that day, he drove down to town, the truck groaning on the icy road. The nearest settlement was a collection of buildings stitched together by habit more than necessity. An old diner, a gas station, a hardware store, and the Flat Creek Public Library. The librarian, a woman in her late 50s named Martha Ellison, looked up as he entered, her smile faltering when she saw his military posture and unfamiliar face. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked cautiously. "I'm looking for any local records," Ethan said, removing his gloves. "Property deeds, missing persons, anything about a man named Marcus Heller." Her expression changed. Not surprise, but something like hesitation wrapped in fear. "Dr. Heller?" she repeated quietly. "Yes. He used to live up in Winter Hollow, didn't he?" Martha glanced toward the back of the library, where 2 other patrons sat pretending not to listen. "He did," she said finally. "Though it's best not to stir up old stories, Mr. Ward," Ethan supplied. "Ethan Ward." He gave her a steady, reassuring look, the kind that said he'd seen worse truths than whatever she was afraid of. She exhaled softly, then led him to a filing cabinet older than both of them. From a drawer labeled Town Archives, 2008 to 2012, she withdrew a thin folder marked Heller Marcus, Incident Report. Inside were a few photocopied pages, a black and white photo of a man in his 40s with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a brief note from the county sheriff's office. Subject missing as of October 11th, 2013. Vehicle recovered. No signs of struggle. Case closed. "That's it?" Ethan asked, frowning. "No follow-up? No investigation? Martha shook her head. They said he ran off. Corporate trouble, maybe. He was working on some new product for Savarus. Everyone thought he took something he shouldn't have. Her voice softened, almost reluctant. But that's not what folks around here believe. What do they believe? Ethan asked. She hesitated, then leaned in slightly. That he found something he wasn't supposed to find, and that Savarus made sure he couldn't tell anyone about it. The words hung between them like frost. Martha looked away first, suddenly busy rearranging a pile of returned books. You didn't hear that from me, she muttered. And you'd best leave that cabin be, Mr. Ward. Some doors aren't meant to be opened again. Ethan thanked her, though his mind was already racing ahead. As he turned to leave, she added softly, He had a dog too, you know, a black lab named Jasper. The locals said that dog wouldn't leave the property after Heller vanished. They found it months later, still guarding the porch. Driving back through the snowstorm that evening, Ethan couldn't shake the image, the loyal dog waiting for an owner who would never return. Ranger lay quietly on the seat beside him, eyes half-lidded, trusting. For a long while, neither of them spoke. When the truck, finally, crested the last hill and the house came into view, the wind had died, and the sky was painted in bruised shades of blue and silver. He parked at the foot of the hill again, staring at the cabin's silhouette against the dying light. Somewhere in there, Marcus Heller had lived, worked, and vanished. Somewhere in there was the truth no one wanted to name. Inside, the fire had gone out. Ethan lit the lantern, its glow trembling across the room. He laid the notebook on the table, next to an old coffee mug still faintly stained at the rim. Ranger trotted over to the fireplace again, sniffing the stones, then looked back at him with a quiet urgency. I know, buddy, Ethan murmured. We'll look tomorrow. He sat down, opened Heller's notebook again, and let his eyes trace the final entry. The handwriting was rushed, uneven. If anyone finds this, know that they lied. It's not nutrition, it's control. The formula changes behavior, weakens resistance. Children are most susceptible. They want it approved by Christmas. God forgive me. Ethan stared at the words until they blurred, until the silence of the house began to press in around him like a weight. He felt the old instinct rise again, the one that had kept him alive through war zones and betrayal, the certainty that danger wasn't coming. It was already here. Ranger shifted beside him, ears flicking toward the window. Outside, something moved through the trees, soft and deliberate. A shadow detached itself from the darkness, lingered near the porch, then vanished. Ethan rose quietly, his hand finding the familiar shape of the knife on his belt. He turned down the lantern's flame, casting the room in half light, and waited. Whatever ghosts haunted this place, they were no longer only of the past. The night was thick with silence, the kind that seemed to have weight, pressing against the windows and muffling even the wind. The fire in the great stone hearth had burned down to a steady amber glow, sending ribbons of warmth through the cabin's chill. Ethan sat back in the old armchair he'd found, the leather cracked and worn, a relic of someone else's life. Ranger lay nearby, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but vigilant, the faint rise and fall of his chest the only sign of rest. Outside, the forest murmured in its sleep, the occasional crack of ice echoing across the valley like distant gunfire. Ethan stared into the fire, the dance of orange and gold reminding him of nights overseas, different fires, different battles, but the same uneasy peace. He thought of Dr. Marcus Heller's last words scrawled in that notebook. It's not nutrition, it's control. The phrase lingered in his mind like a shadow he couldn't shake. Then Ranger's ears twitched. A low growl rumbled from his chest, subtle at first but growing in depth. His eyes locked on the hearth, not the door, not the windows. The hearth. Ethan straightened, his instincts rising to meet the tension in the air. What is it, boy? He murmured. But Ranger ignored him, stepping closer to the fire. The dog's nails scraped against the stone floor as he pawed at the base of the hearth, a rhythmic, impatient sound. Ethan frowned. "Hey, stop that," he said softly, but the command only made Ranger more insistent. The growl deepened, mixed with a whine of frustration. His fur stood on end, tail stiff, body coiled like a spring. It wasn't fear, it was focus. The kind of alertness Ethan had seen in him years ago when he'd scented danger in places where men's eyes saw only peace. Ethan leaned forward, the flickering firelight throwing restless shadows across the stones. That's when he saw it. A faint line, a difference in color where one rectangular slab met the next. The mortar around it was darker, smoother, as if someone had repaired it long after the original construction. He reached for his flashlight, the beam slicing through the gloom. The line became clearer, deliberate. His pulse quickened. "Good boy," he murmured, rubbing Ranger's neck. The dog's body trembled with restrained energy. Ethan set the flashlight down and went to the old toolbox he had brought from the truck. The metal clinked softly as he pulled out a crowbar, its surface cold and heavy. He crouched in front of the hearth, feeling that quiet anticipation that always came before discovery or trouble. The first strike of metal against stone made a dull clack, followed by another and then another. Tiny flakes of old mortar crumbled away, releasing the scent of earth long undisturbed. Ethan worked methodically, the way he'd learned to disarm traps. Slow, patient, deliberate. The dark seam began to widen until finally, with a sharp crack, the edge of the stone shifted. Ranger barked once, low and sharp, as if urging him on. Ethan wedged the crowbar deeper, muscles straining. The slab groaned, resisted, then lifted with a gritty sigh. He dragged it aside, his breath fogging in the cold air now spilling up from below. What lay beneath was not soil, but a small hollow, just deep enough for a man's forearm. Inside, nestled in the dirt like a secret heartbeat, was a black metal box, the kind used by scientists or soldiers to store sensitive equipment. Next to it were 3 leather-bound notebooks, their covers cracked, the pages swollen with age and damp. Ethan stared at them for a long moment before reaching in. The air that rose from the cavity was stale, with a faint metallic tang, as if sealed off from the world for years. He lifted the box carefully, setting it on the floor beside him. It was heavier than it looked. The top was scratched, and across it, etched crudely with what must have been a nail or knife, were the words, "If you're reading this, it means they didn't erase everything." The handwriting was uneven, desperate. Marcus Heller's final message. Ethan felt a knot tighten in his chest. He glanced at Ranger, who stood watching silently now, the firelight glinting off his amber eyes. "You found it," Ethan whispered. "You damn good boy. You found it." The dog's tail wagged once, slow, deliberate, then stilled again. Ethan took a deep breath and turned his attention to the box. The latch was rusted but intact. He pried it open with the crowbar, the hinges shrieking in protest. Inside lay a series of glass vials secured in foam padding, each labeled with dates and alphanumeric codes. The liquid inside them shimmered faintly, some clear, some cloudy. There were also small packets of what looked like powdered samples, and beneath them, sealed plastic folders filled with lab reports. The Savers Foods logo appeared on every page. He scanned the first document, his frown deepening with every line. Terms like behavioral modification, synthetic additive, and cognitive response in minors leapt out at him. Charts of test results, dosage studies, and side effects filled the pages. One line, handwritten at the bottom of a report, made his stomach turn. Revised Batch 9 approved for commercial testing. Pending board clearance. Long-term neural effects inconclusive. Ethan dropped the page on the floor and ran a hand over his face. "Jesus, Heller," he muttered. "What did they make you do?" He opened the first of the notebooks. The early entries were clinical, detached, notes on formulations, taste tests, and child focus groups. But as the pages went on, the handwriting grew more chaotic, the sentences longer, more urgent. Heller wrote of internal pressure, of threats disguised as promotions, of being told to adjust data to meet deadlines. Then, the final entries shifted from fear to panic. They've started the trials without clearance. The compound causes elevated aggression, dependency on sugar intake, decreased impulse control. They don't care. It keeps kids wanting more. It keeps parents buying. The last line, barely legible, read, "They sent someone to review my findings. If I don't report by Monday, they know." Ethan closed the notebook slowly. He could feel the cabin breathing around him, the walls expanding and contracting with the wind. Somewhere outside, a branch snapped under the weight of ice. Ranger's ears perked up, his gaze flicking toward the door. The soldier inside Ethan resurfaced in an instant, his senses sharpening, muscles coiling for movement. He turned off the flashlight, letting darkness reclaim the room except for the flicker of the fire. For a moment, the world narrowed to sound. Ranger's quiet breathing, the whisper of the flames, and beneath it all, something else. A faint mechanical hum, far away but deliberate. A vehicle engine idling in the distance. Ethan's heart rate slowed, not sped. Training took over. He carefully replaced the box and notebooks in the hollow, slid the stone slab back into place, and brushed dirt and ash over the seams. The house looked untouched once more. Ranger stood beside him, ready. Ethan grabbed his coat and rifle, moving toward the window. He pulled back a corner of the curtain. Down the hill, barely visible through the trees, a pair of headlights glowed, unmoving, watching. The engine cut off. Silence swallowed the woods again. Ethan stayed by the window long after the lights vanished. He didn't sleep that night. The fire died, the cabin chilled, but inside him something had begun to burn, a slow, steady conviction. Whatever Marcus Heller had uncovered, it wasn't just about bad food or corporate greed. It was about control, of bodies, of minds, of innocence itself. And now he had inherited that truth. He looked down at Ranger, who stared back with quiet understanding. "We're in it now, partner," Ethan said softly. "And they already know." The morning came gray and slow, a reluctant dawn creeping across the mountains like smoke. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that was almost too clean, too deliberate, like the world had paused to see what Ethan Ward would do next. Inside the cabin, the air still smelled faintly of ash and cold metal. The crowbar lay on the floor, streaked with soot, beside the black steel box that sat waiting like a confession. Ranger slept near the door, his body curled tightly, his breathing shallow but steady. Ethan hadn't slept at all. He'd spent the night listening, to the creaks of the house, to the shifting wind, and to the new weight that had settled on his shoulders. When the first light brushed the windows, he finally reached for the box again. The latch opened with a dull snap. Inside, the vials and documents lay exactly as he had left them. But now, in daylight, they looked different, more human somehow, as though each object carried a story of betrayal. Ethan lifted one of the sealed plastic bags, holding it up to the light. Inside was a small square of freeze-dried food labeled Kidjoy Test Batch 7A. The packaging was neat, sterile, clinical, yet beneath the printed label were faint smudges, fingerprints that told of haste, maybe fear. He set it down carefully and unzipped another file, this one filled with lab reports marked confidential, not approved for release. The first page was dated December 15th, 12 years ago, 2 weeks before Marcus Heller disappeared. The data was meticulous, though even Ethan's untrained eyes could see the pattern. Immune suppression, liver inflammation, neurological anomalies. Each line was a quiet scream written in numbers. Notes in the margins caught his attention. Handwritten corrections and desperate questions. Pediatric sample response inconsistent. Adverse events in 43% of cases. Why is this being ignored? And then another line, circled in red ink. Projected launch still approved for Q4 despite incomplete safety data. Ethan flipped through the rest, page after page of evidence buried under bureaucratic indifference. At the back of the folder, he found a photograph, blurry, taken in a lab. Marcus Heller stood among a group of smiling executives holding a clipboard. Behind them, a banner read, "Savarus Foods, Innovation for every family. Heller's smile didn't reach his eyes. Ethan sat back, his heart heavy. He remembered the base hospitals he had visited during his service, the children of soldiers who came to see their fathers off, waving tiny flags with sticky fingers. He could still see their faces, bright with innocence, untouched by the cruelty of the world. Now he imagined those same children consuming a product laced with chemicals designed not to nourish, but to control. His jaw tightened. This wasn't just corruption, it was a war on trust itself. He turned to the notebooks again, flipping to the final section of Heller's journal. The entries were written in a hurried scrawl, ink blotched and smeared by sweat or tears. They came to the lab tonight, said it was a compliance check, but I saw the man in the gray suit watching from the hallway, the one from corporate legal. I think they're going to shut me down. I copied the files to the backup drive and hid the rest under the hearth. If they find out, I'm done. Ethan paused, reading the next page, written in trembling lines. They don't want the truth buried. They want it erased. I can't let that happen. Someone has to know what's in those meals. If you find this, whoever you are, please finish what I couldn't. The words struck him like an order given from a dying soldier. Ethan closed the notebook and looked around the cabin, the cracked walls, the broken table, the lingering smell of fear. Heller's last stand had happened here, and now it was his. He rose, pacing slowly. Ranger lifted his head, ears pricking at the sound of movement. We can't keep this here, Ethan muttered. If they know what's inside, they'll come back, and next time they won't just watch. He gathered the documents, sealing them in a waterproof bag from his pack. Every movement felt deliberate, as if some unseen clock was counting down. Once he was done, he walked outside, the snow crunching under his boots. The world was white and blinding, the mountains gleaming like frozen sentinels, but even beauty felt sharp today. Ethan went around to the back of the cabin where the ground dipped into shadow. There, half buried under frost, was an old generator shed. He pried it open and found a dry spot beneath the flooring, an old supply pit, big enough for the box. He lowered it gently inside, covering it with a tarp and wood planks. The snow would hide it well enough for now. When he returned to the front of the house, a sound caught his ear, the faint hum of an approaching engine, not from the main road, but from the woods to the south. Ranger stood stiff, fur bristling, a low growl vibrating through his chest. Ethan's pulse steadied, his mind calculating. Too soon, he thought. They didn't waste any time. He moved inside, shutting the door quietly, and crouched by the window. Through the frost, he could see the outline of a black SUV weaving between the trees, slow, deliberate, hunting. He waited. The vehicle stopped halfway up the hill, engine idling. A figure stepped out, a tall man in a long coat, his breath visible in the air. Ethan couldn't see his face, but he didn't need to. The stance, the deliberate stillness. It was the same as the men he'd seen guarding convoys in Iraq. Professionals, not locals. The man scanned the property, hands in his pockets, before turning back toward the SUV. He said something to the driver, then both doors slammed shut. The vehicle backed away slowly, disappearing down the path it came from. Ethan stayed frozen until the sound faded completely. Then he exhaled, his breath shaking. They were testing him, sending a message that they knew exactly where he was. He looked down at Ranger, whose eyes were fixed on him, waiting for command. Yeah, Ethan said quietly. I got the message. That night he built a fire again, more out of ritual than comfort. He couldn't shake the image of the black SUV disappearing into the forest. The quiet was too thick now, no longer peaceful, but anticipatory. He sat at the table with Heller's last notebook open before him, reading every line as if it were a map. Each page painted a clearer picture of how deep Savarus's corruption ran. Contracts with government suppliers, falsified safety data, executives bribing inspectors. But one entry near the end made him stop cold. If something happens to me, look for the Ark. It's not a lab, it's the vault where they keep the source compound. Only the top board knows where. The Ark, Ethan repeated aloud, the name rolling off his tongue like a code. Ranger's ears perked. "Guess we just found our next step," he said softly. Outside, the wind picked up again, whispering through the trees like distant voices. The world was closing in around them, but for the first time since coming to Winter Hollow, Ethan didn't feel lost. He felt anchored, to Heller's words, to Ranger's loyalty, to the faint thread of purpose pulling him forward. He reached down, scratching behind the dog's ears. "You ready for another fight, old boy?" Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor. Ethan looked back at the flickering fire and saw not warmth, but resolve burning there. The kind that couldn't be extinguished, not by fear, not by greed, not even by death. The truth was out of the box now, and it was his to protect. The storm was still a whisper when the black SUV returned, 2 days after Ethan first saw its shadow between the trees. The air was heavy with the promise of snow, a silence so deep it carried its own kind of warning. Ranger felt it before Ethan did, lifting his head, ears pricked toward the sound of tires grinding over the frozen dirt road. Ethan stood by the window, rifle within arm's reach, eyes narrowing as the vehicle stopped halfway up the hill. This time, only one man stepped out. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, the kind of calm that belonged to someone who thought he was in control. He was tall, wrapped in a charcoal overcoat, with silver hair slicked back and a scarf perfectly knotted at his throat. The snow flurries clung to him, but he didn't seem to notice. When he knocked on the cabin door, it wasn't a demand, it was an announcement. Ethan opened the door halfway, keeping the rifle low but visible. "You're trespassing," he said evenly. The man smiled faintly, his voice deep, measured, and edged with charm that had long since turned into arrogance. "Mr. Ward, I presume? I'm Silas Trent, Executive Vice President of Savarus Foods. I thought we might have a civilized conversation." Ethan's jaw tightened. "About what?" Silas glanced around the cabin, taking in every detail, the rifle, the unlit lamp, the faint smell of smoke. "About avoiding unnecessary trouble. We're aware that you came into possession of certain materials that don't belong to you. I'm here to make that go away." He reached into his coat, pulling out a checkbook. The gesture was smooth, rehearsed, the way one might draw a weapon in a duel they'd already won. $100,000, Silas said. "You walk away. We handle the cleanup, no one gets hurt." Ethan let out a short, humorless laugh. "You think I'm for sale?" Silas's expression didn't change. "Everyone is for sale, Mr. Ward. You just haven't named your price yet." He placed the check on the table between them, the ink still glistening under the low light. For a moment only the wind spoke. Ethan stared at the paper, then at the man who'd brought it. His eyes were calm but cold. "You made a mistake coming here," he said. Silas tilted his head. "No, Mr. Ward, you did, when you opened something that wasn't meant to be opened." The air in the room shifted. Ranger growled softly, moving closer to his master's leg. Ethan took a slow step forward until the space between them felt tight with tension. "You're trespassing on private property," he said quietly. "You can walk back down that hill, or I can help you roll." For the first time, the executive's composure cracked. His smile faded, leaving something darker in its place. "You don't understand," Silas said, his voice low, almost pitying. "The world doesn't reward men who cling to the truth. It buries them, deep." Then he turned, adjusting his gloves as he stepped back outside. "You'll think about it," he said over his shoulder. "Everyone does." The SUV started, reversing down the hill until its taillights were swallowed by the gray dusk. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Ethan stood still for a long time, his reflection flickering in the window like a ghost. He picked up the check, tore it neatly into 4 pieces, and dropped them into the fire. The flames caught quickly, curling the paper into ash. Ranger watched, ears twitching, as if he too knew what that act meant. "They'll be back," Ethan murmured, "and they won't knock next time." By nightfall, the storm had arrived. Snow fell in thick sheets, the wind howling through the eaves like a living thing. The power flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. Ethan lit a lantern, its soft glow painting gold circles on the walls. He moved through the house in silence, checking the locks, loading the rifle, setting candles where the light would reach the corners. Ranger followed him, silent but tense, every muscle ready. The temperature dropped fast, the windows frosting over from the inside. When Ethan tried the radio, all he got was static. The landline was dead. Sometime after midnight, the first sound came, a sharp crack, then another, like wood splitting under strain. Ethan froze, listening. The wind roared, but underneath it, there was movement. Ranger lifted his head, a low growl rumbling from his throat. "Easy," Ethan whispered, moving toward the window. The porch light was out, but the snow's reflection gave everything a ghostly glow. At first, he saw nothing. Then, there. A shadow darted past the tree line. Another followed. 3 shapes, maybe 4, moving low, fast, coordinated. Ethan moved quickly but quietly, dousing the lantern and crouching by the door. He could hear them now, boots crunching snow, the faint metallic click of a weapon safety being released. His heart didn't race. It settled into that slow, controlled rhythm he knew so well. Ranger's eyes glinted in the dark, 2 golden embers. "Stay close," Ethan whispered. A window shattered at the side of the cabin. Cold air rushed in, followed by the sound of footsteps. Ethan fired once, warning shot, deliberate. The intruders paused, whispering among themselves. Then came the reply. A single gunshot, shattering one of the lanterns. The next few minutes were chaos, shadows and flashes, snow swirling in through the broken window, the smell of smoke and gunpowder filling the room. Ethan moved like he was back in the field again, every instinct sharp, every breath calculated. Ranger lunged toward the door as one of the men tried to break through, teeth flashing in the dim light. A yell split the air, followed by the sound of boots retreating. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the night went still again. Ethan stood motionless in the dark, the barrel of his rifle smoking faintly, his pulse steady. Outside, the blizzard screamed against the walls, masking every trace of what had just happened. Ranger limped slightly, a shallow cut on his shoulder, but his tail was still, his eyes alert. Ethan knelt beside him, running a hand through his fur. "We're okay," he said softly. "For now." He glanced toward the shattered window. The snow had already begun to fill the gap, erasing the footprints outside. The storm would bury everything by morning, the blood, the glass, the truth. But Ethan knew this wasn't over. The SUV, the men, the threats. None of it was meant to end tonight. This was just the warning shot before the real assault. He looked at the fire, its flames dying low, and thought of Marcus Heller, of the words etched into the steel box. "If you're reading this, it means they didn't erase everything." Well, now they were trying again. He stood, checking his rifle one last time, then pulled the heavy curtains across the windows. Outside, the wind howled like a living memory. Ranger settled beside the bed, eyes half closed, but listening. Ethan sat down, exhaustion creeping in, though his mind refused to rest. Somewhere out there, Silas Trent was already planning the next move. And somewhere far beyond the storm, the Ark waited, holding the key to everything. Ethan didn't know what would come next, but he knew one thing with absolute clarity. He wouldn't run. Not this time. The night erupted without warning. It began with a single sound, a faint creak on the porch, barely louder than the howl of the storm. And then, chaos. The door shuddered, the glass exploded inward, and 3 dark figures poured into the cabin like shadows with breath. The muffled hiss of suppressed gunfire cut through the wind, bullets thudding into wood and wall. Ethan dropped behind the overturned table, his rifle already in hand, his mind switching from thought to instinct. Ranger was faster. His growl broke into a roar as he launched forward, a streak of muscle and fury in the dim light. The first man went down hard, his weapon clattering to the floor, his cry swallowed by the storm. Ethan fired a warning shot toward the others, the sound deafening in the small room. "Stay away from the hearth," he shouted, voice hoarse against the wind. The men hesitated, glancing toward the fireplace where beneath the floor lay the secret they had come to erase. Outside, a voice rose above the blizzard, deep, commanding, unmistakable. "Burn it!" Silas Trent's words carried through the night like a death sentence. "If you can't take it, destroy it." The next moment, the sharp smell of gasoline sliced through the air. Flames licked the window edges, hungry and fast. The room filled with the roar of fire meeting cold. The wooden beams crackled, smoke curling toward the ceiling. Heat slammed into Ethan's face as he crouched lower, covering his mouth with his sleeve. Ranger barked sharply, circling him, refusing to retreat. Ethan grabbed the dog's collar, his mind racing. The front door was blocked, the back engulfed. "This way," he muttered, forcing open a side window just as a wall of flame burst behind them. They plunged into the storm, snow and smoke swirling into one violent blur. The air outside was so cold it burned, but Ethan barely felt it. The fire behind them devoured the cabin, orange light blazing against the white fury of the blizzard. Ranger stumbled beside him, his fur flecked with ash, but his eyes, bright and alive, never left Ethan's side. Then, through the wind, came another sound. At first, Ethan thought it was thunder, but it was too rhythmic, too controlled. A deep, pulsing thump that grew louder by the second. He looked up. Through the torn clouds, a beam of white light split the darkness. Then another. Helicopters, 2 of them, cut through the storm, their searchlights sweeping across the hill. Ethan's knees nearly buckled with relief. The insignia on the nearest aircraft was unmistakable. FBI, followed by the black and gold crest of the Federal Health Bureau. Voices boomed over the loudspeakers, carried by the wind. "Put your weapons down. This is a federal operation. Savorous Foods is under investigation." The surviving attackers froze, confusion flashing through their ranks. From the ridge, spotlights caught the shimmer of rifles trained from above. Silas Trent stood near his SUV, his face pale and rigid as the snow whipped around him. For the first time, he looked small. The helicopters landed in a flurry of snow and light. Agents in dark jackets fanned out, weapons drawn, voices cutting through the storm's roar. "FBI, on your knees!" Ethan watched as one by one the armed men dropped their weapons. Silas turned to run, but a spotlight pinned him in place. "Silas Trent," a voice shouted, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and endangerment of public health." He tried to speak, his words lost to the wind, before being slammed face first into the snow by 2 agents. Ethan stood in the chaos, smoke rising from the burning remains of the cabin behind him, the flames throwing long shadows across the hill. Ranger leaned against his leg, trembling but unhurt. One of the agents approached, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a badge gleaming under her parka. "Mr. Ward?" she called over the wind. He nodded once. "You've done the right thing," she said. "We received your encrypted message last night, the documents, the coordinates. You did what Heller couldn't finish." Ethan exhaled, the tension finally leaving his shoulders. "He deserved better than silence," he said quietly. As the agents moved in to secure the site, Ethan turned back toward the flames. The house, the $100 cabin that had begun all of this, was collapsing, timbers snapping like gunfire. He felt no grief for the loss of wood or stone. The truth had survived. That was enough. Ranger pressed closer, and Ethan knelt, his gloved hand brushing through the dog's fur. "It's over," he whispered, though even as he said it, he knew the world rarely allowed for endings that clean. The storm raged on, but now the light cutting through it felt different, like dawn breaking after a long night. Weeks passed before the snow melted. The headlines came fast and relentless. Savorous Foods under federal investigation. Tainted meals recalled nationwide. Whistleblower scientists' legacy restored. Marcus Heller's name, once buried, was now spoken with honor. Families across the country watched the story unfold, parents clutching their children tighter as anchors spoke of the dangers that had nearly gone unnoticed. Ethan refused every interview. He stayed in Winter Hollow, where silence meant peace again. When spring arrived, the hill was green once more. The ashes of the cabin had mixed with the thawing earth, feeding the wild grass that now swayed under a gentle wind. Ethan stood where the hearth once was, hands in his jacket pockets, the weight of everything behind him but not forgotten. Ranger lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed in contentment. The air smelled of pine and new beginnings. Ethan looked down at his old companion and smiled faintly. "We did what we had to, didn't we?" Ranger's ears flicked in response, his tail giving a lazy thump against the soft ground. "You saved me again," Ethan said quietly. "Guess we're even now." He turned toward the horizon, where sunlight spilled across the peaks, the snow still clinging to the highest ridges like ghosts refusing to leave. In that light, for the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. He had a small wooden post driven into the earth beside him. On it, a new sign gleamed in the sun. The letters were carved by hand, steady, deliberate, unpolished, but true. "This place does not belong to fear. This place belongs to truth." The wind picked up, carrying the words across the empty valley, and for a moment Ethan imagined Heller hearing them somewhere, finally at rest. Ranger stirred, leaning against his leg. Ethan glanced down, his expression soft. "Come on, partner," he said, turning toward the dirt path leading down the hill. "Let's build something new." As they walked, the wind whispered through the trees, blending with the faint hum of distant engines, leaving the valley behind. Winter Hollow stood quiet once more, but this time it wasn't haunted, it was free. The light over the snow hill is more than a story about a veteran and his loyal dog. It's a reflection on the eternal battle between truth and fear, integrity and power. Ethan Ward never sought glory. He simply refused to let lies win. In the cold silence of winter, he discovered that courage can outlast darkness, and that truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way back to light. Ranger, his steadfast companion, reminds us that real strength isn't in the weapon you carry, but in the heart that refuses to surrender. Truth may sleep beneath the snow, but it can never be extinguished. Where courage endures, spring will always return. Thank you for watching and for walking this journey with us. Where courage melts fear and loyalty stands against corruption. If Ethan and Ranger's story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share to keep these stories of truth, hope, and humanity alive. May you always have the bravery to face the dark and the faith to find the light within your own journey. See you in the next story, where every heart carries a flame that never dies.